Okay. Dear all, we are now ready to proceed with the second debate of today. The topic is a very interesting and extremely relevant one now: the future of NATO, deterrence and defense in the new strategic environment. This panel is coordinated by the Center for Defense and Security Strategic Studies of Carol I National Defense University and will be moderated by Colonel Florian Cârciumaru and Colonel Dan Petrescu. Colonel Cârciumaru, PhD, is the director of the Center for Defense and Security Strategic Studies, a structure that has a particular profile within Carol I National Defense University as a functional unit for fundamental research in the field of national defense and security. Colonel Cârciumaru co-led NATO Defense Education Enhancement Program, DEEP, effort within Moldova and supported DEEP initiatives in Georgia. Colonel Dan Lucian Petrescu, PhD, is Chief of Research and Development Department within the Center for Defense and Security Strategic Studies. As for his academic career, Colonel Petrescu was a lecturer in Multinational Operations Department within the Security and Defense Faculty of Carol I National Defense University. Colonel Petrescu is the author of many papers and books in the field of defense, strategy, electronic warfare, and war games, being the recipient of several awards, the Romanian Military Thinking Awards included. Gentlemen, if you'll please proceed with the next debate.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so I suppose that we can start the panel. The distinguished generals and officers, distinguished members of international and national academic community, dear professors and researchers, PhDs, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Colin Kuchumaro, as I have been introduced previously, and I have the honor, together with my colleague Colonel Dan Petrescu, uh, to welcome you to the second panel of the conference named The Future of NATO, Deterrence and Defense in the New Strategic Environment. As an introduction sequence, I remind you, everybody, that starting February 24 this year, as we can realize day by day, the world has dramatically changed and the security environment as well. This is equally true for the challenges we face now. Besides the well-known threats and challenges as climate change, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, political instability, religious and resources competition, and many others, we face now another reality, the real, the real but cruel war that has broken our lives and changed the security environment at regional and international level. Now, speaking about the purpose of the panel, you'll notice very interesting topics on its agenda. And so I see here a wide avenue for operational and scientific academic cooperation. I'm very confident that a constructive and positive dialogue on the latest results of the regional and international developments in the field of security and defense is commencing here. Both new and past events have started to be correlated, providing a new perspective on potential risks, dangers, and threats to international security, and particularly to European countries. On the other hand, I refer, on one hand, I refer to the repositioning on Russian Federation as an international actor able and willing to achieve its political goals through military force. And on the other hand, I would mention those phenomena that have impact on the entire Europe, whether we speak of NATO and or EU member states, aspirant crisis, uh, emerging crises, including the refugees and displaced person flow, the illegal immigration and human trafficking, the resurgence of the nationalist extremism, and of the terrorism phenomena, and etc. The recent evolution from the Black Sea extended region are representing a turning point at the regional and global levels, which indicate a reconfiguration of the spaces of strategic influence and the strategic repositioning in this part of the world. They have led to a more complex and less predictable security situation that is in flux and therefore less tangible. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to consider a candid open dialogue and approach in debating the topics presented, as we are confirming with the Chatham House rule your efforts truly contributing to a better knowledge and understanding of the subjects. In this respect, we will follow the standard format of the conference, lecturing the author's presentation within the current panels. And in the end of the panel, we will have time enough for questions, and hopefully we have time enough for questions and answers, debates, comments, and remarks from the audience in order to broaden and understanding our understanding on the topics by addressing questions to our speakers and not only. The diversity of the participants, consisting of representatives with academia, political, military, and civil society background, certainly supports an inclusive approach to the discussions. We have 5 high-class speakers with great experience, both in the field and in the academic environment. I would nominate the speakers, Mrs. Cynthia Salum, faculty advisor and senior researcher at the NATO Defense College, Rome; Major General Karol Dimanowski, deputy chief of the general staff of the Polish Armed Forces; Antonia Kolibashanu, representing the geopolitical future; Philip Peterson, New Generation Warfare Center; and Major General Julian Berdila, chief of the Land Forces staff. The topic of the panel will cover a wide spectrum of subjects, as challenges of the alliance when it comes to deterrence and defense, strategic consideration to the threats and challenges, and practical solution in dealing with them and or a potential counterpart, hardship and challenges that NATO and the member states must face regarding to the new geopolitical reality, and perspective of NATO 2022 concept by an assessment from a red point of view. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further comments and introduction, we'll move now to the first speaker, which is Dr. Cynthia Salum. She is a faculty advisor and senior researcher at the NATO Defense College in Rome. Before joining NATO Defense College, she was respectively a Max Weber Fellow at the Department of Political and Social Sciences, an associate researcher at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies of the European University Institute in Florence. Her research and teaching cover topics of international relations, political philosophy, diplomacy, foreign policy, political violence, radicalization, and international security, with a focus on the role of the non-state actors. Dr. Cynthia, please, the floor is yours. And
thank you very much. I'm going to be seated here. I was given the option to stand, but I'm very well surrounded, and I think it makes it a bit more convivial, and hopefully we'll be able to interact together a bit later. So when I realized I was going to speak just after lunch, I prepared myself a set of notes. So forgive me if I rely on them. The reason is we have little time and I have a lot of things that I want to share with you. I'm going to go through a little, let's say, presentation of a couple of ideas that pertain to our security environment today, where we are in the current situation in Ukraine, in terms of the implications for NATO but the EU. I will also cover the consequences of the decision that were made at Madrid and their feasibility. And finally, I will reflect on, and this is very much inspired from the first panel. I was sitting back there and finalizing my notes on whether we are now at a time where we need to disentangle realpolitik from the defense and the interests of liberal democracies. Obviously, my discussion is going to include the nuclear threats. This is one of the topics that I was working on lately at the NATO Defense College. So bear with me if I am systematic. I go back to my points. It's better than divagating and not being able to finish. So first and foremost, the situation in which we are today is quite familiar. We are in a situation where Europe is at once weaker and more vulnerable vis-à-vis Russia. This is a situation that we know very well from the Cold War, but the difference is that today Europe doesn't have several hundred of thousands of US troops on its territory, and it makes a difference. Obviously, we've seen the US engagement in terms of troops on the European territory increase. We've seen the 101st Airborne Division deployed to Europe for the first time in 80 years. This is symbolic and it's important. However, we know that the nature of threats and challenges around the world and the pivot to Asia will not allow necessarily the United States to keep increasing its presence and to maintain it through time. So the challenge that we have from the point of view of defense and deterrence is how is it that we can give teeth again to the alliance, if I want to use the words of Dean Aitchison in September 1950. And it's a very important thing to do, because we all know, and everyone has repeated this a million times, we were at a time where we lost the reason why we were making an alliance together. And obviously the threat of Russia is back. This is one thing, but how is it that we can transform this into an efficient alliance, able at the same time to be able to defend, so able to deter? Because it is only when you're able to defend that your deterrence will actually work. The US has agreed since Crimea to reinforce the eastern flank, and we've seen since Madrid the promise of 300,000 troops that would be deployable in 180 days. It's a quite of an ambitious agenda, very much questions whether it's realistic that we achieve this capacity. I'll keep this open, but the question of feasibility was at the heart of the discussions in NATO HQ until the very last minute before the Madrid summit. At the same time, it's important, from a strategic communication perspective to show what you're able to do. But on the other end, it's very difficult to promise capabilities that you actually can't deploy. So that's for NATO. For Europe, we have a serious tension. We have a clear tension between higher defense budgets and current economic difficulties. We've heard this in the first panel. We have inflation, we have an energy crisis, we have work shortages, and it's not clear how we would be able to sustain the high level of debt and increase our defense budgets. And this is quite complicated. It's playing out politically in all ways. We've seen it play out in the election in Italy, for instance, and this is only one example, in my opinion, of what's expecting us in Europe in the coming decade. So the Madrid summit was a wake-up call. From the point of view of the refocus of the alliance, from the 360 ideal, which we also heard in the framing of this panel today, we all want to be able to do 360. It would be absolutely fantastic to be able to do this. But the focus on DDA, it was absolutely urgent, and the Madrid summit allows us to, come back to what we are made for, what we're able eventually to do if we continue to unite our efforts. Now, the difficulty is that in the past more than a decade, since the last NATO strategic concept, we've been fighting together on whether we're looking to the east or whether we're looking to the south. And we tend to think in dichotomies like this, and in exclusive terms. So either the Atlantic or the Mediterranean. And for the US, either the Atlantic or the Pacific. Reality is very different. And if the situation in Asia continues to unfold the way it is unfolding, meaning China is not in a good place. China has a very serious crisis to face, and this is a good news for us because it would allow us to keep both the Atlantic and the Pacific in our range of possibilities. It would allow the US to keep presence and support to Ukraine and to the Europeans. Now, the question from the European point of view is our range of responsibilities. How much are we able to play the role we ought to play in our neighborhoods? And it's a very important question. Unfortunately, we do not have the capabilities, we do not have the readiness to play this role in order to relieve US efforts on the one hand, but also to contain Russian and Chinese encroachments. Now, if European strategy has any means, I believe very strongly that it should start with the Western Balkans. This is absolutely the place where European security has to start and where European security can be bolstered. Of course, we have Libya. Of course, we have Tunisia and its future. Of course, there is Syria and the whole Mediterranean. But all of this demands unity of efforts and focus. Libya is important, and we shouldn't forget this. So we may need in Europe to create ad hoc groupings. I have my Polish colleague on my right, and I'm sure he will agree with me that Poland is not gonna make a lot of efforts to the south. You don't have the means to waste these efforts with the current situation. So this situation demands from the European Union a very important renewed alliance with Turkey. If we are not able to build an agreement on the nature of stability and security in the Mediterranean with the Turks, unfortunately, we won't be able to grant from a European perspective, whether within the EU or within the European territory of the alliance, a 360-degree or at least minimal control on security in the Mediterranean, plus the focus to the east. Now, what are we doing within NATO? For Ukraine, France and Germany could do more, and we've seen this, and the figures are quite clear. The US has significantly expanded its pledges for support for Ukraine. We've seen over 52 billion euros, with the last pledge of 12 billion euros from the part of the United States. Only 1.4 billion were pledged in the past couple of months from Europeans. This is still too little. Just to give you some sense of figures, 2% of the total stock of tanks in NATO and the EU has been pledged, 4% of howitzers, and 5% of the multiple launch rocket systems. In this figures, Germany has given 12% of its howitzers and MLRS, and France 15% of its MLRS. So I know that we are not rich in capabilities, but there is some effort that could be done in that perspective. The other problem is that the Europeans have pledged aid, but a lot of the aid has not been yet received. It hasn't reached Ukraine, and this is something that definitely needs to be rethought and dealt with as soon as possible. My third point, as I promised, and I'm not really following time. I'm sorry, I don't have a watch, so I don't know where I start. 2 minutes left, you say? Okay, so I'm gonna go faster than this. We are in the Ukrainian context in a situation where we have an excellent congruence of values and interests. And we've seen this analysis also unfolded in the first panel. Yet, I think that we have to pay attention to the not to push, this congruence too far. The Biden administration started its mandate with a very strong emphasis on democracies versus autocracies. I believe that this made things more difficult with China, and I believe that it also worsened the situation with Russia. Of course, we can frame, and we should frame to some extent, the context as a battle for democracy. It's important, of course, but including in Russia, we know that the war is a way of keeping Putin's grip on Russian society. However, settlements on values are very difficult to be done. At the end of the day, a settlement in Ukraine will imply talks with the devil if needed. So I'm very sensitive to the promises and to the energy that's given to us by Ben Hodges earlier, but I'm very worried about what it means. We need to be able to do trade-offs, and trade-offs on territories are way easier to be done than trade-offs on values. So negotiation about status and values are difficult. We need to be able to negotiate square miles and borders if possible. And I know that on the Ukrainian side, this preparedness is not necessarily there. It reflects, and I'm going to try to finish fast here, the asymmetry in the transatlantic relation. It always has been this way. There is a very strong asymmetry of power and of vulnerabilities. The US is more and has always been more idealist in its ambition, and the Europeans have always been more realist vis-a-vis the Russian threat. And this is not new. This is not Biden's administration positioning. This is there since the NSC 68, since the 1950s. So we know that Angela Merkel kept an Ostpolitik as long as she was able to do so, because it was profitable, but also because Germany is weak. It was weak and it's still weak. So the EU has to understand that the huge focus of its power that is based on the policy of human rights and on democracy and democratization abroad is not enough. Hard power is important too. Now, a word about the nuclear threats. And of course, I'd be happy to discuss more of these elements, and I'm sure that my colleagues will bring more to the discussion. Putin's escalation so far is essentially about deterrence, in the way I see it. The signal is to say to NATO, keep your support limited. The problem is that a reversal on the ground makes tactical weapons more probable. Not saying they're going to be used tomorrow, but the chances that they are used are real. Now, yesterday, the CIA director and his Russian counterparts met in Ankara. And I guess this is a good thing. And we've seen also the Chinese and the Europeans, we've seen a bilateral meeting between my president and Xi Jinping that shows that China and India are willing to isolate Russia if there is a use of nuclear weapons. All of these elements are important for us to seize as an opportunity, first to make sure that we are working together towards escalation control, and this is very important from both ends of the Atlantic, and second, to rethink our deterrence that has failed both conventionally and from a nuclear perspective. And I'm going to end there, even though I have more to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your excellent, do you hear me? Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. It was a thorough and I would say complete presentation, short presentation of the security environment. It is very important to have that right in the beginning of our panel, and it gives me the opportunity to introduce the next speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce Major General Karol Dymanowski. I will give you some coordinates related to his career. Prior to his current assignment, he is the Deputy Chief of General Staff of the Polish Armed Forces. Major General Dymanowski served as Deputy Chief of Staff of the Strategic Development and Preparation Directorate within SHAPE in Mons. Our guest today also held other important positions in the Polish Armed Forces, such as Director of Armaments Policy Department and Chief of the Non-Kinetic Operations Division, where he was responsible for branches as civilian-military cooperation, InfoOps, and psychological operations. Major General Dymanowski holds a Master of Science in Electronics and Telecommunications at the Military University of Technology in Warsaw, and a PhD degree in Defense Science at the National Defense University. He also completed postgraduate studies in operations and tactics, as well as in defense policy, such as flag officers and ambassadors, course at NATO Defense College, Rome, and the operational tactical post-graduation studies at the National Defense Academy in Warsaw. Now, today, Major General Karol Dymanowski will provide us with very valuable strategic considerations, the threats and challenges identified in the current and the future security environment in close connection with the insights given by our previous speaker. Furthermore, he focused on the deterrence and defense mechanisms, configuring a perspective of practical solutions in dealing with them and/or a potential counterpart. This is a good food for thought in focusing in the efforts towards adaptation of NATO approach to deterrence and defense in this dynamic and complex context of security. Major General, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I have been sitting for a couple of hours, so let me use my 10-minute slot not only to deliver my speech, but also to stretch my legs. So generals, admirals, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. First and foremost, on behalf of the Chief of the General Staff of the Polish Armed Forces, thank you very much for your invitation. For me as a Deputy CHOT, it is a great pleasure to represent Polish Armed Forces today and be here with you to discuss topics which are so important for the security of not only Black Sea region and the eastern flank, but also for the whole alliance. And being Polish officer in Romania, I just can't pretend that I'm an expert in Black Sea region. And therefore, in my speech, I will focus on some general thoughts on deterrence and defense of the alliance. Slide, please. And firstly, I will discuss strategic considerations concerning emerging security environment. Next slide, please. Okay, here we are. And I will focus on threats and challenges we are facing today, and then I will describe the drivers which are stimulating the need for NATO adaptation. Secondly, I will provide an idea of approach of turning the strategic considerations into some practical, tangible solutions for our armed forces. And I will conclude with some general thoughts on deterrence. Next slide, please. So let me start with a brief description of threats and challenges to our security. We live in a very dynamic and turbulent world, which can be characterized by holistic challenges and systemic competition. Our competitors and potential adversaries pose systemic challenge, employing a variety of tools to achieve their objectives. And these tools, these instruments of power, are coordinated under centralized and very often authoritarian regimes. And knowing our strengths and weaknesses, they employ their weapons, they employ their tools in hybrid campaigns, in the gray zones and below the threshold of conflict. And that is why, apart from global transnational threats like climate change and pandemic, we have to deal with the threats posed by our enemies who use geographically unlimited domains like cyber, like space, like information to conduct their malicious activities. In addition, they use non-military areas for coercion, so they weaponize energy, migration, infrastructure, information, and food supply. And against this backdrop, NATO must constantly adapt its posture and capabilities to be prepared for this strategic competition. Next slide, please. And in this context, from my perspective, resilience is of paramount importance for systemic readiness of the alliance. And we have to work individually and collectively to improve our national, regional, and alliance resistance. At the same time, we have to adapt our armed forces to be ready to respond to the complex threats. An ongoing implementation of multi-domain operations concept is a good sign of this highly needed evolution in NATO. Another good example is integrated deterrence concept recently introduced in the newest US national security strategy. Just as our competitors, we have to make use of new domains and emerging technologies, develop our cyber, space, and cognitive capabilities in cognitive domains, and introduce cutting-edge technologies like artificial intelligence or quantum-based applications to our armed forces. New domains and technologies can enable NATO to achieve unprecedented speed of operation. But to fully use this potential, we need to further improve our intelligence collection and sharing mechanisms to provide timely intelligence and indications and warnings. We must continue to build enablement network, and we have to adapt posture of our forces in terms of geography, readiness, and domain. And concurrently, we have to reorganize ourselves to use emerging security geography connected with the accession of the new members to NATO, challenges related to the Arctic, and our 360-degree approach. So now the real question is how to turn all those strategic blah, blah, blah in considerations into some practical and tangible solutions for our armed forces. I'm fully aware that neither we have enough time nor we have a proper security in here to discuss deterrence in details and defense in details. So therefore, I would offer some academic and kind of schematic approach, which I believe might be a good base for the further and more detailed discussions. And next slide, please. So here we are. This is a scheme or a system, if you will, for implementation of means and tools which can be used by the armed forces to deter and defend in coordination with or in support of other instruments of power. At the input of the system, a proper set of resources is required, including the right balance of trained and equipped armed forces, adaptive enablement network, interoperable communication and information systems, 24/7 and multi-source intelligence, and as always, a proper injection of money. But altogether, these resources are indispensable for preparation of three main pillars of each and every military activity, which is plans, posture, and command and control. And from my perspective, the core pillar is planning. And as you know, we have two sets of plans in NATO: defense planning and operations planning. So defense planning is about long-term planning of force development, while operations planning is about the force employment. And these planning procedures have to be closely aligned with C2 arrangements, including organization, procedures, and authorities. On the other hand, they have to be coupled with our posture, that is disposition and readiness of forces by geography and domain, collective training and exercises, as well as strategic communication. And this alignment with posture and C2 could provide the key feature of every plan, executability. And these three pillars should be overlapping and interconnected to build a basis for a military instrument of power to provide credible, tailored, and effective deterrence, which should be the output of our system. Slide, please. In conclusion, I would like to offer just a couple of thoughts on deterrence. It is a very hot topic that has been debated by many scientists, leaders, and commanders for years. But in the face of aggressive Russia and growing tensions with China, I think that we constantly need to reconsider and, if necessary, reinvent our deterrence. And besides armed forces, we have a wide portfolio of tools to conduct deterrence. They can be put under one well-known acronym, DIMEFIT, which is on the left-hand side of the slide. And we have to use those tools in a balanced and adaptive manner. And every time and for every opponent, we have to design a bespoke deterrence campaign. But regardless of the opponent, regardless of the adversary, there are two fundamental questions we have to ask ourselves. First one, is the opponent deterrable? And how to know it? If the answer is positive to that question, here comes the second one, how to deter effectively and how to measure it. So with that slide and with those two questions on the slide, we can now get back to the 24th of February and ask ourselves, was it possible to stop Russia from invading Ukraine? So in other words, was Russia deterrable? And if so, what we could have done better? And I will stop here. Next slide. That is all from my side. I know that I have just touched the surface of the problem, but conscious of time, I just presented some strategic considerations on our security environment, and then I propose a schematic, kind of academic approach, how we can implement the strategic consideration to some tangible solutions which might be used by our armed forces. And these tangible, practical solutions are plans, posture, and command and control. That is all from my side, and now I'm looking forward to your feedback, questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for your compressed but very comprehensive presentation related to analysis of the threat and challenges related to the new security environment. And also, you mentioned something which is very important for the military, at least, but not only. You mentioned about the first phase of the crisis management system, indications and warnings. We should pay attention, more attention to the critical indicators. We can see them before something wrong will happen, but we don't pay the right attention maybe. So this is one point that I have to highlight in the end of this short analysis of your presentation. Thank you very much for your presentation again, and we will have for sure questions in the end of the presentation. We'll move to the next speaker, Mrs. Antonia Colibășanu, Chief Operating Officer in Geopolitical Future. I will have a short bio and I'll present you some words about. She's a senior geopolitical analyst focusing on strategic competitive intelligence analysis, currently holding the position of Chief Operating Officer at Geopolitical Future, a guide to navigating to the future. She joined Geopolitical Futures team as senior analyst in 2016 after working for more than 10 years with global analysis from firm Stratford in various positions, including partner for Europe and vice president for the international marketing. She works closely with best-selling authors George Friedman and Robert Kaplan, and served as honorary advisor to Romania's Ministry of Energy. Among other academic credentials, she holds a doctorate in international business and economics from Bucharest Academy of Economic Studies. She is a lecturer within the International Relations and European Integration Department of the National School of Political and Administrative Studies in Bucharest. That's all for the moment, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. It is always a pleasure to be part of this annual gathering that has established a tradition. It is always a pleasure to read the magazine and find new thinkers on strategy. So that said, I've prepared for today a presentation that has a PowerPoint that was discussing the future of NATO and the current geoeconomic reality. I will, however, adapt to our current discourse and comment on some important questions that were raised during the other two presentations and during today's presentation in the morning. I will start, please, next slide, please. So I will start by basically framing what I mean by geoeconomics, because this is a puzzling term, even if you kind of get the idea where it's going. It's basically about how we control our finances and our flows, trade flows, investment flows, and everything else in order to gain a competitive advantage towards the other. In other words, if we regard NATO primarily as a military alliance, and if we consider truthfully that NATO has expanded into being a political alliance, we also need to keep in mind that with that comes the economic dimension of things, and we should regard the economy as part of an alliance that is supporting politically and militarily the operations of NATO. Now, obviously, we are not engaged in an economic alliance. We have the EU for that. But because things are complicated, not all NATO members are EU members, and not all EU members are NATO members. That means that for the first time, we've basically entered into a global economic war without necessarily having an alliance to fight it. At the same time, we do have an understanding to fight the kinetic warfare in Ukraine, which is pretty much regional, while we are tempering and hoping to deter Russia through the economy. Now, what does this have to do with the new geoeconomic reality and NATO future? Please, next slide. Okay, I'll begin by looking at the world from Russia's perspective, because this is how we should begin looking at the world. NATO was established as an alliance to deter the USSR, to fight the USSR. Now, we are in the 21st century fighting again against Russia, and not necessarily fighting, but defending our own values and our own economic systems and our own political systems. Now, we are talking about democracy. We are talking about, capitalism. We are talking about all the systems that are supporting our will to fight for. However, we kind of detached ourselves from understanding how things have changed for us as Russia has changed its view on the world. So by looking at this map, which is kind of upside down, we're basically seeing the flanks of Russia. We are seeing what Russia is interested in, and that's beyond Ukraine. That's beyond the Black Sea region. Obviously, we have the mountains as, serving as territorial borderlands, but we must not forget that Russia as a global power is also stretching from the north towards the south, which makes the new containment line in between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea and beyond, but also takes into consideration what's happening in the higher north in the Arctic and what is going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. Since February, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we have started to live a different reality where all the interconnections are getting more accelerated in interconnecting one with each other, which basically makes all the tie knots, all the places, the geographical places where the worlds meet, to change their vision and to change that vision very rapidly from becoming peaceful to becoming conflictual to becoming again peaceful. Now, next slide, please. The one place that is pretty much at the core of things nowadays because of the Russian invasion in Ukraine is obviously the Black Sea. At the moment that I was putting together the slides, which was in, well, the graphic, not the slides, which was in September, we were already seeing a low sail zone in the Black Sea from Crimean to the upper northern Romanian coastline in the Black Sea. Now, fast forward, next slide, please. We're beginning to see a very much of a hole in the Black Sea area. And economically, we are starting to look at the war zone when we are talking about the war, the Black Sea. From a business perspective, there is limited willingness to do anything in the Black Sea. There is limited willingness to ship anything through the Black Sea because it has become dangerous. Now, if that happens in the Black Sea, in the other seas, it has repercussions. And I'm not just talking about the potential food supply crisis, the grain agreement and everything else. I'm talking about general shipping lines and general contractual limitations that have to do with the ports and beyond. Next slide, please. Now, we are talking also about a very important player that has grown in importance since February, which is Turkey. And geoeconomically, we are discussing about the importance of Bosphorus from both of a point of an economic standpoint, congestion. Congestion happens currently in the Bosphorus. It also happens nearby Constanza. It also happens along the coast, the western coastline of the Black Sea, which makes things a bit more complicated. And congestion also happens on land, on the South Caucasus routes that go from Turkey to Russia and from Russia to Turkey. That basically established Turkey as the de facto negotiator. Now, we are at a point in the war where we are seeing Turkey trying to play up its cards, not only in the Black Sea, but also in the Eastern Mediterranean. And at the same time, we're at the point of the war when everyone is afraid of a new escalation, but everyone also hopes of negotiations taking place soon. Now, from an economic perspective, the market, next slide, please. I forgot about this. So from an economic perspective, the markets are talking about no reassuring negotiations taking place. Inflation is pretty much on the high up. And the way that states are tackling inflation, next slide, please, is pretty much different from the kind of state that is tackling inflation. That is driving a kind of a reset of the economic modeling as we are looking at the military kinetic warfare and as we are looking at the influence that the war has over the political systems in general. Now, we are basically seeing the advanced states taking the classical model of tackling inflation by classical monetary policy, which is having to do with interest rates, while we are having the emerging states looking to find alliances and looking to keep quantitative easing going, which is kind of reassuring that there is money in the market and everything is going well. That is, by the way, also explaining the European model, which has the dual, both tackling inflation through the interest rates and quantitative easing, which is kind of stimulus packages to help what's going on with the economies. Next slide, please. What basically happens right now through these remodeling is a realignment. Obviously, you're familiar with the G7 and the BRICS. There are the two groups that basically are supporting one side or the other. But, however, both the G7 and the BRICS are looking elsewhere. We have seen reports about countries wanting to join BRICS, as we have seen reports about G7 being active in getting new partners beyond what it was supposed to be doing, looking to Africa, looking to countries like Argentina to get help and support when it fights against Russia. The problem that we are having now, and this is basically my concluding remarks, is that we are discussing about NATO's future in a situation where the global economy is pretty much in realignment, and we are also seeing a systemic and structural change. That means that we are discussing a sort of a global NATO. Mostly it is related to the way that we are driving the budget for defense, but at the same time, it is about the way that we are talking strategy. And that has to do with the political and more even with the economic background of things that is driving the political aspect of it all. Another conclusion that is a sort of a question is how much do we want NATO to go into politics? Because if we are talking about the global view of NATO, we are basically talking about the pivot that is political growing stronger over time. So it is us, and I have no answer, obviously, it is us and our economies that will deliver an answer to that. It is us and our economies that will deliver the answer to how we are going to tackle China in the whole equation. But for the moment, I think that NATO is waking up to new systemic changes that are affecting its will to fight and its way to fight, hybrid and everything else. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I allowed myself to jot down some ideas. So you said about global economic war. I would say that we have been living in global economic war since the beginning of time. Only the means have changed and the way to achieve objectives have changed, but the focus is the same, getting more resource and sustaining every action you do. Anyway, one layer of the multifold crisis that affects our way of life, the economics domain holds many question marks when it comes to sine qua non condition of sustaining the very instrument of providing security. Providing green energy and maintaining the necessary flow of resources and goods raise challenges that we all must deal with in the near future. If not, we already do this. Now, I will introduce the next speaker, Dr. Philip Peterson. He's the president of New Generation Warfare Center. Dr. Philip Peterson previously served in a series of roles at the Potomac Foundation, which gave him the opportunity to understand the Russian approach to security and defense and to conduct interesting projects such as security policy in the post-Soviet republics and Baltic security net assessment for the Baltic Defense College in Tartu, Estonia. Dr. Peterson also conducted multiple tours for US congressional staff delegations to Eastern Europe to promote an increase in NATO membership. He also served for 15 years as a United States Army officer, as an intelligence analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency and as a policy analyst of the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the National Defense University. Dr. Peterson's unique educational and career experience drove him to author many publications on international security issues, focusing on ex-Soviet space. Now, today, in the light of his experience, Mr. Peterson will give us a unique perspective on NATO 2022 concept by presenting an assessment from a red point of view. I always advocated the idea of increasing the odds in grasping a better understanding of a potential counterpart by wearing his eyes, looking through his glasses when judging a matter of concern of high importance. I strongly believe that investigating the subject from the other part will provide us valuable insights that would give us the real opportunity to have the upper hand in any potential confrontation. Dr. Peterson, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, sir. Okay, we're going to just skip ahead to essentially the blue. Well, I guess we're not going to skip ahead. That's good. Okay. All right. So next slide, please. All right. Everything that I'm going to say here from the red perspective is documented in the first volume of our 2-volume work on what we call the Eastern Front. We don't call it a flank in World War III because that's exactly what we're already in, World War III. Next slide, please. We're going to essentially reflect Russian new generation warfare comprised of these 9 elements. Next slide. And we are going to pull out 9 aspects in the NATO's 2022 strategic concept and contrast the NATO perspective with the Russian perspective. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through the red. You might already know the blue, or you can certainly read the blue. Now, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, Russian Federation are, in all senses, the same imperial state paradigm. From its perspective, no country incapable of successfully defending itself in Moscow's feudal vision of the world has any right to choose its own path. The strongest rule. Next slide, please. NATO was dancing around the idea, individual and collective resilience. This sounds like strengthening the body politic, and it also suggests that the Americans and the Europeans understand that the Russian trolls are like termites eating away at the foundations of Western liberal democracy. But Moscow was so confident that it states outright that of course we have, do, and will attack Western election systems, since they, the Russians, understand that not less than 1/3 of Western societies are authoritarian personality types. This is an ongoing challenge to liberal democracy and constitutes a problem that will not solve itself. Next slide, please. No liberal democracy can be at peace. Moscow is at war with all liberal democracies. But the priority has been to weaken the European Union by getting England, the way they view Great Britain, England, out of it and breaking up the United Kingdom, as well as to get the United States out of Europe. So they have their own version of the version that the first U.S. Sec General said when he retired. Let's keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. That's their version, okay? I just gave you their version. The Russians, next slide, please. The Russians simply consider this aggression that I list here about authoritarian actors, etc., to be the non-kinetic elements of new generation warfare. So NATO sees these alternatives to war, when in fact Russia calls all these hybrid ideas that we have, and by the way, they say explicitly they do not have a doctrine or philosophy of hybrid warfare. That is a NATO concept. So they view these kinds of things we call as hybrid as simply new means, and sometimes more effective means, by which to wage war. Next slide, please. Moscow intends to destabilize not just European members, neighbors, and NATO partners, but has targeted full-time operations to destroy the European Union and NATO. That's just a fact. So get over it. The BRICS in operation to weaken the European Union is considered to have been a smashing success. And they brag openly at Moscow events about their success in putting their guy in the White House as part of their operation to remove the United States armed forces from Europe. They continue to pick candidates on the American radical right. And they run training programs in Hungary, a NATO ally, to develop fifth column movements with which to undermine democracy by openly assisting this external attack. Next slide, please. The kleptocratic government of Putin's imperial state understands full well that it is practicing a contemporary form of feudalism. Hence, that government perceives the liberal democracies as a concrete and existential threat. To say we're not a threat to the Russians just as a gross misunderstanding of the challenge the Russians face. Moscow, therefore, perceives NATO's statements of posing no threat to it as being disingenuous. We really can't be serious. It's really not the fact of NATO troops on its borders, however, that threatens the Muscovites, but having liberal democratic culture and a market economy on its border that threatens their politically primitive state. We need to understand, why did Putin invade Ukraine? Because young Ukrainians have repeatedly demonstrated they were not going to have their futures robbed from them. And there were no reason for them to sacrifice themselves so Western liberal Europeans can live comfortable lives. They were determined to live like Europeans. The Ukrainians and the Poles were living at the same economic standard in 1991. And they look across the border and they see how the Poles live. The Poles are Europeans. Why can't we be Europeans? The real threat wasn't that Ukrainians would become Europeans. The threat was that Russians would see Ukrainians become Europeans. And if that happened, the empire was over. Next slide, please. The Russian General Staff clearly understands that it cannot defeat NATO with its non-nuclear forces. It also understands no matter what it does, it cannot prevent a decisive counterstrike by American nuclear forces. Therefore, the Russian General Staff would be unlikely to recommend initiating a kinetic conflict so long as it doesn't believe that its escalate to de-escalate strategy will succeed. Now, we can discuss that about whether or not they think it can succeed. There's clearly a couple of the Zapad exercise would suggest maybe it might with the Germans and the French. Thus, it comes down to perceptions of will. Unfortunately, today, the Russian General Staff has little to no influence on the Kremlin belief system. Next slide, please. I'm sorry. I'm going to skip the blue, go to the red. Everything said about NATO above in this statement here is true. Everything makes sense. Everything is logical. The idea that we have different sources, centers for making the decision of using nuclear weapons does complicate military planning from the Russian General Staff's perspective. However, it doesn't reflect how the Russian General Staff perceives reality. The Russian General Staff believes that the Americans are dangerously confrontational, which means you have to handle us prickly, folks, very delicately. That's how you get deterrence, because deterrence is in the eye of the beholder. Doesn't matter what we think, what that guy thinks. I believe the Brits will go along with the Yanks. The French will go if France is attacked, but probably only if attacked with nuclear weapons. And the Germans won't go under any circumstances. Now, I'm not making accusations up here. I'm just telling you how the General Staff talks about us. Next slide, please. All right, my last slide. This is probably going to be the most offensive for some people. Arms control is probably a necessary NATO pursuit to obtain public support for its security policies. Unfortunately, the Russian security structures do not believe in arms control, except as a means by which to limit Western defensive efforts in fields in which the Russians cannot successfully compete or pose a severe risk to their ability to defend themselves. That's what it is. Now, we don't have to like the way they think. We don't have to agree with the way they think. But if you want deterrence to work, you have to understand how they think and why they think that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peterson, for your very, very interesting presentation. So it's quite very interesting because you made an analysis from two opposite point of view, red point especially, and from your presentation are rise some ideas: individual and collective resilience, the lack of peace for the liberal democracy. Also, in the view of the Russian Federation, the aggression is non-kinetic elements of the new generation warfare, or another one that come out from the action that Russian Federation last actions, for last eight months actions are to destabilize European Union and also NATO. This is an idea and an invitation for us to check your books, to check your ideas, and for sure we will be able to implement in our practice of day-by-day activity those ideas. Thank you very much once again. And please allow me to introduce the next speaker, which is one of the most experienced Romanian officer, generals. It's about Major General Iulian Berdilă, the Chief of Romanian Land Forces Staff. And I will, with your permission, I will introduce to you a short bio of the general. He has been Chief of the Romanian Land Staff Force since 2020. Among his many prior joint and multinational staff assignments, we can mention the most important as J5 for the Land Component Command, NATO Integration Planner for the Romanian Land Forces, Commander of Headquarters Multinational Division Southeast, and the Head of Strategic Planning Directorate. His operational experience includes deployments in multinational force Iraq as Coalition Operation Planner and in ISAF Afghanistan as Battalion Commander with the 1st Mechanized Brigade in Zabul Province. Major General Berdilă holds a Master of Military Arts and Science degree from the U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies and the Master of Strategic Studies degree from the U.S. Army War College. Major General Berdilă is the recipient of several national, allied, and multinational awards and decorations, including the NATO Non-Article 5 Medal, U.S. Bronze Star, and the U.S. Army Commendation Medal. Sir, the floor is yours, please.
Well, good afternoon, and for such an invitation and privilege to be back in the Marble Hall. It's always a pleasure after lunch to be the last. That makes me look like dessert. I know it looks very well. Generals, admirals, distinguished military attaches, distinguished visitors, and dear panel colleagues. The subject today is, as you can see, is very large, and I think for just to get the from the beauty of the Marble Hall to get outside there in the field, at least in the land domain, and see what some of our soldiers are doing. I would ask our colleagues from the conference if I can have the movie that I brought from the land forces.
Romania does not stand alone.
I think our subordinates and our colleagues probably deserve a round of applause. We saw the yes, and this I think is the first factor. We talked about deterrence and defense, but after Madrid, this was the first factor that we, at least in the land domain, felt very practically. Solidarity, and the first to be mentioned was the Collective Defense Battle Group. France, Netherlands, and Belgium, with France in the lead, they brought just the 1st Battalion to be operational by the end of this year in its base, and then to continue that operational process the next year. Poland has been with us with the Multinational Brigade Southeast for rotations so far, and we contributed with the ground-based air defense capability and packaged in Poland, reversing and mirroring that cohesion that I was talking about as a result of the ally solidarity. Portugal joined us with a contingent that, again, with Multinational Brigade Southeast, they train together. We also have the United States partnership and presence consolidated in Romania, and other allies and partners are about to join. But what I mean is, again, under the word solidarity, you saw in a very little time and space how the allies responded to the measures after the Madrid summit. I would also mention that I'm a force generator and manager with a budget from the land forces, but I'm proud to support the readiness of at least 3 headquarters that serve an allied flag, and that's Multinational Brigade Southeast, Multinational Division Southeast, and the most recent one, the Multinational Corps Southeast, which is about to reach the FOC the beginning of 2023. That's an articulated backbone of command and control of so much, or factors so much needed for having the plans synchronized and being ready to train, plan, organize, but also act in case of crisis. I would touch a second point when we looked at the war in Ukraine. We all debated in the land also with John Petrescu, the strategic leaders, what's a myth and what's confirmed, what's denied in the doctrine of what we knew about the conventional war, or maybe determining some of the factors of hybrid. Well, I can tell you, I'm convinced, I was convinced, but I'm still convinced that armor maintains its relevance. So armor in the land domain and the way you plan, organize, and employ armor capabilities remains important. Yes, to some points, you have to understand the doctrine of combined arms and what's the maneuver armor package that you need to train and maintain out there as a capability. Sometimes, as we saw on the Russian side, basically a massacre of armor just because of wrong employment in the tactical and operational environments. Anti-armor, I think it's very much relevant to today. So the more rockets in terms of anti-armor capability, the more rockets you have towed the other versions present out there, I think they make a good result if you know, again, how to employ what's the sensor to shooter to anti-armor capability, but what is the very fast target acquisition shooter process that you can distribute very down to the maybe squad and platoon level. Urban operations, I think they remain relevant. With General Petrescu, we started last year, actually 2 years ago. Last year we validated, and today we have another military operations urban terrain range in Chinku that at company level you can train even in a multinational environment. I think that's very relevant for the land troops today and the all the brigade and below capabilities to make sure we train for that environment too. Number 3 that I would like to mention, especially for the land forces, is the human factor. I think there's an evolution of the soldiers' requirements that we have today. And you can talk the active soldier, you can talk the reservist, or you can actually talk maybe cyber defender. But an active soldier today, and you saw the HIMARS, serving the HIMARS, I need a soldier with more modernized skills in a digital world. To operate a HIMARS is not just my old time as being a field artillery officer, just doing the old methods to operate field artillery units. Today, technology has an impact and automatically has an impact on the human resource that you're trying to select and recruit. Also, the reverse of that is the higher package of skills you require in a soldier. Well, guess what? it gets more expensive. It's more expensive to keep a force today with skills to the level of readiness and technology that we have, not just in the land forces, but into the other services than it used to be. And that puts us, the force managers, and the challenges we have in the budget of how do you balance the acquisition budgets over the personnel budgets, and how do you produce professional development from the soldier to the NCO, and then to the more senior leaders, officers, and general officers. Last but not least, I'd like to mention the importance of the industrial base. We can today, and with the effort we have to support the Ukrainian conflict and the resources that actually flow into that, it's huge. And we have to understand the speed of the acquisition process between determining requirements, allocating budgets, but also producing just the consumption rate, let's say, for training. What's the consumption rate? What's that package of stockpile for, let's say, class 3, POL, and then the class 5, the ammunition. Just try to compute that for one brigade, maybe one division. You'll see how that has the impact of today's operations in Ukraine. Very important, because I think it's a dual solution of what we have today in the national industrial base, but also how the other companies can actually help with other tools and means to support the development and the consolidation of the industrial base. I'm a strong believer that consolidated measures and presence of the allies in Romania should be synced with a push forward of the industrial base effort to have this concert between what we keep in the readiness, but we're also ready to produce in Romania and in the other allies. I would close with just the last point. We need to make sure we continue professional development for the young leaders. You can go, I invite all of you, those who were present there, and go visit the Land Forces Academy or any other academy of the other services. Go look into the eyes of the young leaders and the cadets in there, and you'll see they understand they're a generation of impact of what's going on in Ukraine. Now, it's on our shoulders to make sure we commit that energy into providing the professional development for the young leaders, not just the officers, the NCOs, and the enlisted. Just to make sure, like I mentioned, we keep the what I call the most important acquisition program for the land, which is the human, the soldier. I would close here and wait for the other panel colleagues to receive lots of questions from you. But remember, I was a dessert, so don't look at these guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I think we had high-class 2 Michelin star dessert, so thank you. So, this concludes our panel, and I would like to briefly go through everything has been said. First, we talked about the challenges of the alliance when it comes to deterrence and defense, then the strategic consideration to the threats and challenges and practical solution dealing with potential counterpart, then the hardships and challenges that NATO and member states must face regarding the new geo-economic reality, then a unique perspective on NATO 2022 concept, an assessment from the red point of view, and last but not the least, Romanian efforts in training and equipment acquisition to strengthen the NATO deterrence and defense and deterrence and defense posture. Now we only have time for 2 questions, so please, if you have any questions. We have mobile microphones in the room. Okay. Here, please.
Just mention your name, your membership, and just put the question and address to whom.
Do we have the mobile microphones?
I have 2 questions. So
okay, I'll give you mine. That's okay.
Thank you, Colonel Petrescu. Thank you very much. Mario Marinov, Unibid, Bulgaria. Now, going back to the topic of deterrence, and I'm going to get back specifically what General Demanovsky said, mainly that indeed deterrence is constantly there is a rethinking, a reevaluation, a reinvention of the concept constantly. And I would like to ask, how do you see in the future deterrence, and specifically nuclear deterrence, being reinvented in consideration of the qualitative and quantitative factors, characteristics, and capabilities of opposing powers, and how they have developed technologically, the inclusion of new actors into the mix of the deterrence calculation. And I was also going to ask a question about conventional deterrence. General Berdila here, though, made quite a good presentation on what NATO is building, especially Romania is building in the eastern flank. And yes, we have to remember that conventional deterrence existed before the nuclear one. And especially on the eastern flank, that would also be a key policy and also a technical goal and topic. So to whom the question is addressed? Well, in terms of policy or in terms of technical capabilities, we had a few remarks. So whoever would like to take up the word, I would be very glad to receive an answer.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I have your answer, but about the future of deterrence and including all of these aspects, and also it requires some time to go through the quantitative and the quality aspects of nuclear deterrence itself. But I want to come back to one of the points that was made by Philip Peterson on the escalate to de-escalate doctrine. One thing is for sure is that the Russians in their document in 2000 have very clearly shown to us that the use of limited nuclear strike to compel the adversary to back down is something they were seeing from a defensive perspective. And at least this is how I read it. So basically, the way they would use it is a way to return to a status quo ante. And that's, that this is what their doctrine has been portrayed to do, and this is what they might attempt further in the future. So what would nuclear deterrence be in the future, qualitatively, given the new technology? I'm not able to respond to this part. However, something that is really necessary to take into account is to think nuclear deterrence as, again, a field that needs to be developed seriously by nuclear powers, but also to think about, we heard about warning indicators, but the signaling also. One thing that was highlighted also by Philip is the fact that the Russians believe that the Americans will strike if need be. My president has created some contradiction in saying that France would not react with the use of nuclear weapon if it was used. So, how is it that from a doctrinal perspective, we can have a nuclear deterrence strategy while not having the same approach to the use? There's also the question of the first use, but I'm not going to go into it because I see that I'm striking debate here and I want to have your response to this.
I agree completely that we need to have a discussion of how to respond to the tactical use of nuclear weapons. Remember, the Russians have, unlike the Americans, the Russians have continued to develop their tactical nuclear weapons to such a sophisticated extent that they are, I can say, openly unclassified. They are less than 0.2 of a kiloton. So imagine that. So small that you might not even know and be sure at that moment that that's what you had just been hit by. On the other hand, the United States has taken a position that we have technologies, or we are not going down the road of nuclear use. I think I'm glad the Russians understand that if they destroy America, it'll be a bad day for the Russian peoples as well as the Americans. So let's not destroy the world. That's the idea. But I think that the United States position is very clear. We're not going down the road of nuclear use with the Russians. If they use tactical and nuclear weapons against us, our allies, they will be punished. We have other technologies, some of which we can't talk about here, but we have technologies where we can punish them. And I think the Russians understand that. So I think I'm less worried about nuclear use. If you look at the new generation warfare, Element 9, which I've never, ever seen discussed in Europe, okay? Because don't talk about nuclear use. We're not talking about nuclear use. The document says the threat of nuclear use, okay? The threat. Now, when the Russians play exercise with Zapad, they have used nuclear weapons, usually to prevent the enemy from continuing the war. They want to force us to negotiate. And you take a look, 2009 was the classic example in this regard. They failed with the tactical use, and even when that part of that tactical use included the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the continental United States, they hit 3 of our seaports. And the response in the United States was, how in the world do they think that's going to get us to stop? That's not going to stop us. And that's when what they did was they pop a nuke on Poland. Warsaw gets hit in 2 of the Zapad exercises, all right? Because the idea is that will cause the French and the Germans to insist the Americans, we have to negotiate with the Russians. And so I think the lack of discussion is the vulnerability within the alliance. We're not prepared, so we don't have, we haven't talked this through, so we haven't actually done what we need to do to deter the Russians.
Sure, please.
A very short intervention because I heard nukes in Poland, so I have to react. Thank you for the question, even though it's not the one we agreed before the panel. I will try to answer. So just to complement and supplement my predecessor, I think that the part of the question is non-proliferation. Because if everybody has nuclear weapon, it might be not so deterrent anymore. That's all from my side.
Very short on this point. One of the
We're over
most
the time
important...
anyway.
Sorry,
So
one of
please.
the most important thing, and I just want to stress this because it's very important, is the consequences of the war in Ukraine on nuclear proliferation. Because the message there is, if you have a bomb, you keep it, and a bomb will shield you. And we have a lot of work to do and a lot of discussion to do to see who are the next powers that are actually thinking very seriously to open this door and to make sure that we can prevent that from happening. So, yeah, thank you.
Just short, I don't want to touch a lot on the nuclear, but one negative factor, if you want, for me, complementing the other arguments. It looks very toxic to me that the belligerent is ready, we're talking about being ready to employ nuclear weapons, even if he loses. And that's very dangerous for me. I mean, I would look at that as a measure to win tactically or something. No, this is a sick, toxic doctrine of using or employing or threatening to use one of that. Now, conventionally, you mentioned it, just one factor, readiness. We just announced we're moving from 2% to 2.5% next year. That, for me, for the land manager, that is a very good news because it shows consistency to how we predict the readiness of the brigades and the divisions that I have in my force structure. And that means also an infuse of technology and the continuity of that modernization for the capabilities to come. And that produces deterrence. That predictable defense planning, which is synced to the requirements and the allocation from the GDP, I think very much tells you on how deterrence is echoed outside the domain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Even if this issue is one very sensitive one, I suppose that our speaker met your expectations for the question, Mr. Marinov, right? We proved also democracy that works in the scientific events like this one, because we allocated time for for a discussion for everybody related to your question. So, having this in mind, we are a bit over the time proposed for the panel. Please we summarize this one before starting the question and answer session. And please let me conclude the panel by, in a closed session, deserved very well by the speakers and the audience as well. Thank you very much for the participation.
Ladies and gentlemen, panelists, moderators, thank you very much for your input and your answers. And we'll take a 10-minute break and reconvene here for our third panel of the day. Thank you very much.